a basic overview of MVC framework. And one more point is about MVVM, how we have to deal with MVVM. Yes, Vishnu, what is your doubt? If browser disables JavaScript, no client side the world works. That is a very common and basic thing. That should not be a question as a developer, because nothing will work if JavaScript is disabled. No client side technology will work. You cannot use that website at all. And no engines will run in browser. Browser is just having a parser. Parser means only a converter. Translator will be there. There will be no engines running on browser at all. Everything works on your application server where the application is running. Okay, clear? Huh? Right. Right. So how this MEVM pattern works for applications, how we deal with the MEVM pattern works. Where your Angular application is stored, there it will work. Generally, where your applications will run, generally where your application will run, obviously there only these engines will run. Okay. Right. So let's see how this pattern works. Technically, the basic overview about MVVM pattern is already, I told you one point. The approach about MVVM pattern. Generally, MVVM comprises of view. So view. So MVVM comprises of a view, and this is actually the user interface. So view is actually the user interface. This is the user interface. User interface. The UI. That is the view. And technically, it comprises of, that is view. And it comprises of a view model. It comprises of a view model. Generally, we have a view and a view model. So view model. View model. The concept about view model is nothing but view model usually contains two things. One is it contains the state and operations. The state and operations are defined in this. And one more is we generally, it comprises of another one is it usually contains a view, model, and model. The concept of model is simple. So this is a model. We have models. The concept of model is very simple. So the concept of model is already I told you yesterday. It contains domain specific logic. It contains domain specific logic. Domain specific logic is present inside this model. Domain specific logic. Technically, so we have a view that describes the UI, and we have a view model which contains the state and operations. Actually, that is managed by controller in the early. Now what happens is, so whenever so any interactions done, that means from the user interface, from the view, the request will come. The request will come to the view model. The request will come to this view model. So that means usually the data is sent here. The data is sent here, and it sends the notifications to that view. That means what happens here is, in this state, data bindings will happen. Data bindings and commands. Data bindings and commands. That means accessing the data from the UI and identifying the changes in the data. That is all done here. That means view sends the data, and that data is collected by this view model, and it will update the data. It will update the data to the model. So that means it will update the data into the model. This is client side model. Client side model means already we know that. So it contains data in the form of POJO. That means it updates the data. It updates the data. And any model changes will be sent into this view model. Any change in the model will update back to the view model. Will update back to the view model. This view model sends the notifications. That means actually model sends notifications. Notifications. It will send the notifications. Technically, the view model sends the notifications to view model, and view model will update back to the view. Update back to the view. So here all the interactions are managed not by controller. The interactions are managed by view model. Managed by view model. What is the advantage here is view can update the data into model, and model changes can be updated back to the view. Updated back to the view. That is the basic approach happens in this. That means directly whatever changes happening in the view, it can be updated back to the model. And whatever the model changes are there, they will be updated to the view. Updated to the view. This is what actually happens in MVVM. I will show you both techniques practically, how we can implement them. So this is the basic MVVM architecture. The basic MVVM architecture. That means how the data binding happens and how it handles the interactions. Generally, MVC, all the actions are handled by controller. MVVM, all the actions are controlled by view model. View model have the ability to directly update data to model. From the view, it collects the data and updates the data to model. And any changes in the model will directly update to the view. So in various occasions, our Angular application can use both of them. Our Angular application can use MVC as well as MVVM. So generally, in which situation we use this, that we are going to discuss. We are going to see that practically. How to implement this and how to use this practically, we will see now. We will understand about that. So we just had a look over what is this MVC and what is MVVM. How do we implement this? How we can handle and how do we implement this? Let's take a look. That means now we are going to understand how the concept of data binding in Angular, how the concept of data binding works in Angular. Technically, data binding is nothing but it is a concept that allows the UI to update the changes into the model and access the data from the model and bind to the view. That means technically data binding is nothing but, actually data binding is nothing but the model data is updated. The model data is updated to view. The model data is updated to the view. The model data is updated to view. So first point, the model data is updated to the view. That means you can say that the model data is binded to binded. So the model data is binded, right? So that means you can say bound, right? The model data is bound to the user interface, The model data is bound to the user interface, and changes in the view are updated back to model. Changes in the view are updated back to model. That is what actually concept of data binding. Actually, Angular can handle data binding. In several ways. So what are those we will see? Actually, data binding, two types. So data binding is categorized into two types. We have one-way binding, and we have two-way binding. Data binding is categorized into two. We have one-way binding and two-way binding. Generally, one-way binding is nothing but technically. What happens in one-way binding? That I will show you now. One-way binding. Usually, in one-way binding, what happens is the model data is accessed and the model data is accessed and attached to view. The model data is accessed and attached to the view. So it is only one direction. One direction means it is only one direction. That means that is read only. Read only, which means that any change in view will not update back to the model data is accessed and attached to view. The model data is accessed and attached to view. It is only one direction. So that means read only. That means you read and bind to the view. Any change in the view will not update back to the model. That means it is one direction only. We call this mechanism as one-way binding. That means technically, one-way binding, how it actually works is we usually have a model data. So we have model. And this is the data. So we have some data. And this data is binded to the view. That means the data is binded to the view. So it is binded to the view. It is only one direction. It is binded to the view. It is only one direction. Any changes in the view will not update back. That means one way. This is one way. So So no updating back. Then whatever data is present, you can show in the view, but whatever changes happening in the view, you cannot give those updates. Many times we need this. Why? Because we just want to show the details. We don't want any modifications to update back. In that case, we use this one-way binding technique. So one-way binding is nothing but it will not allow update of changes happening in the view. It is just read only, rendering. And generally, that is what actually the concept of one-way binding. Concept of one-way binding. Usually, what happens is, I will show you. So how this works practically, we will see that technically. How the concept of one-way binding works, technically how it works. A one-way binding technique. This is one-way binding technique. That means one-time merging. This is the one-way binding technique. So this is one-time merging. This is one-time merging. That means the data coming from the model, it is binded to the view. Any changes, it will not update back. Right? So it comes from the model or it comes from a template. Template contains some predefined data. Here our main intention is to understand about the template. This is how it happens. This is how it happens. So this is one-way binding. Means how we configure one-way binding. This is one-way binding. Now technically, I will show you this, how one-way binding works. Actually, Angular can handle one-way binding by using following techniques. Angular can handle one-way binding by using following techniques. What are those techniques? Angular can handle one-way binding by using some important techniques. Right. So here, what is the concept of technique here? The concept of technique is nothing but three options are there. We have interpolation. We have property binding, and we have attribute binding. These are the three important techniques used in one-way binding. Interpolation, property binding, attribute binding. How these three things work here? How these three things work? Here, important concept is, we discussed that data is coming from model. Then generally, if data is coming from model, you need to understand one more point, that many times when we design the UI, actually in Angular, there are two techniques. We can maintain the complete logic in the UI itself. Already I told you, inline documentation technique. In inline documentation technique, code, design, logic, everything present in one file only. In that case, data is present inside the template, and that data is binded to the UI. Right? That means you need to think detailedly about that, because already I told you that whenever you are dealing with a component, so component has separation concerns, so it can get the data from separate locations, or component can even access the data from its own template. That means if you are using inline technique, then everything present in one file only. That means the data is present in template. The data we bring from the template and use in the same user interface. That means its data is coming from a model or data is coming from a template. It is binded to the view. Here, why we say template? Because it is depending on the situation. So we can have data in a template also. The template data and the model data can come and bind to the view. So here there are three binding techniques here. One is one-way binding, two-way binding. In that one-way binding, three options: interpolation, property binding, and attribute binding. What is interpolation and what is property and attribute binding? Let's see one example. I will add a new component here. Let's open the terminal and ng generate component. So one way skip test, we are creating a one-way component here. Yeah. Please turn off your cameras, right? Every day I need to tell about that. Are you not aware that your cameras are on? I will do one thing. Next time, whoever turn on the cameras, I will block them permanently. That will be easy, so that they will never forget about that. Okay? Because people keep on disturbing, right? Yeah. Next time I will block them permanently. Okay? Right. Fine. Let's continue. Now I added a simple component here. So we have one way and we have skip test. So one way is ready. Let's keep this in the startup. So every day, no need to explain. We need to go to Bootstrap and Bootstrap with the one way. Okay, one way component. And in the index, we need to start with one way. Right. Okay, one way. Now let's see this one way is working fine. Yeah. Let's launch from this. Yeah, local host, and the one way is working fine. So one way works. So let's go to this one way component. And in this component TS file, I'm keeping it simple. So I will remove the unnecessary part. We don't need that as of now. Later you will understand what is that on init and all. Now initially here I'm configuring. So public, a simple property product. And it is an object and we are defining name and some name. Right, we are defining some price, right? So we are having some details. So we created a simple object which have two properties, name and price. We want to present this data. Now here, this is a domain representation. This is a data object. So here, as of now, it represents a POJO, right? JavaScript object. In this JavaScript object, we have some properties, name and price. I want to present them. I need to access and display. Let's go to HTML. And here we want to display. So div, so class container, that is a container, that is Bootstrap class. We already learned how to configure Bootstrap. And here a heading, product details. I will create a data list with the data term as name and data definition, and another data term as price and data definition. Now this is the output, the product details, the name and price. We need to access the data and bind the data to this data definition. There are several techniques here. What is the first technique, how you can get the data. You can bind the data by using interpolation. You can bind by using interpolation. Interpolation is nothing but actually, so it is a technique. It is a technique used to bind model data to UI by using data binding expression. That is two flower brace. That is the data binding expression. Interpolation is a technique used to bind model data to UI by using a data binding expression. What is advantage is you can use it as a literal. You can use it as a literal. Literal means so no need to bind with any property or attribute of element. You can directly display in any container. Like you can display in any container, like we have a div, we have a span, we have a paragraph, so we have headings. Any containers, you have so many containers you can use in any container. So we have heading, any container, we can use any containers. So any container that can handle the text, just like currently we have data definition, we have TD, table cells, any container that can display the text. So that means now what we can do is here, we can directly handle that. Here. In this container, actually data definition, if I have to display anything inside this data definition, can you tell me, if you are aware of HTML and JavaScript, what is the property of data definition? Or for example, suppose I have a paragraph. If I want to display anything inside paragraph, which property we have to use? Can anyone tell? Which property is used to display inside a paragraph? If you want to display anything in paragraph, which property we have to use dynamically? If you know JavaScript and all. Good. So we have inner HTML and inner text. ID will not display any property, any value. ID, name are used for reference. We have inner HTML, inner text, am I right? You know, inner HTML, inner text like properties are there, right? You have to use those properties. Right? That means we need to display those here. So I'm just talking about general JavaScript. How you display a value in a paragraph. To display value in a paragraph have two properties, inner HTML, inner text. We can add that. Or you can add a child element into it by using append like options. You can add child elements. But directly in paragraph, if you want to display, we have to use inner HTML, inner text. Here also same, data definitions. If you want to display anything, you need inner HTML, inner text. Instead of that, what you can do here, directly you can use a data binding expression. And here we can define product name. You know how to access an object, no need to explain. And how do we display the price? That is product price. We are accessing the price. It will get the details and it will display the details here. That means you can see it is displaying the details here. We are accessing and displaying the details here. So this is an interpolation. remember, we can use this binding expression, and through the binding expression you can directly display as a literal. We can display as a literal. So that is interpolation. So you can bind with any particular property also. For example, that means I want to bind this price to the data definition. If I want to bind the price to the data definition has a property inner HTML, have a property inner HTML. To this inner HTML property, I want to apply some data. It should come from product.price. I'm accessing that product price and display. Inner HTML is a property here. But remember, here when we are trying to display that, it is displaying the data here and configuring the data here. I think majority of you know that when you are writing inside this tag, it is not considered as property, it is considered as attribute. So when you are dynamically using it, then you call it as property. Technically, this is inner HTML. To this inner HTML, you are configuring it. So how we manage properties and attributes in the next level, we will discuss about that. So if you are binding to any text box, suppose I want the product name, I will use another data definition. I will use a text box. Input type is equal to text box. If I want to display that name inside text box, to which property I need to bind this product name? Can you tell me? If I want to display the product name inside text box, then to which property we have to attach? Good. Obviously, you know it should be attached to the value property. That means we have value and value to the value property. To the value property, we are using a binding expression, product dot name. We are binding product name. That means now in this value, if you make any change, you see here text box is also having it. In this value, if you make any change, that change usually should update back into this name property. If it is updated back into that name property, then automatically it should change here also. At the top, you have a product name that should be changed whenever you change the value inside it. Am I right? Understood the point? If I make any change in the value of text box, usually that should be updating back to that property and it should change that at the top. And you can see here in the design, I'm making changes. I'm making changes in this. And suppose I said LG TV, it's not working. That means any change I have done inside the view, it will not update back. It is only one direction. That means we are accessing in one direction and displaying it. Any change in the view will not update back. Of course, you cannot make change here inside this data definition. You can make change here, but these changes are not updated back. If it has updated back, it should have changed that name here also. But it is not updating back. When I reload this, it will get that and display that here. Any change you made here, it is not updated back. So that means interpolation is using one-way binding technique. Right? So that means interpolation, it uses one-way binding technique. So the concept here is it is one-way binding. It is one-way binding. So that means any change, it is one-way binding. That means here the point is any change in the view will not update back to the model, will not update back to the model object. That is what actually one-way binding is. And how this interpolation works. And that is the basic example I showed you here. Basic example we saw here. So that is interpolation. Gradually you will learn so many points about that. Lot of discussion is there about it. Step by step we will reveal every concept and we will go in depth about this. Initially, to understand, I just created one example for you. Add a new component, and the component we added ng generate component. So one way, and skip test. Okay. Next, after adding, so we have to go to one way dot component dot ts. In this one way component ts, we need to add just some logic. So just, I don't need to give you all this code. I will just give you this class, right? Because it is auto generated, right? So that is the class. That means that is the basic here. In the component, we just added one object here. In the component, we are just adding one object here. So just one object is configured there. Okay. In the component ts, so we are adding this. So just we have this property to configure, right? Fine. Now important is one more option is in one way dot component dot html. In the HTML, we need to display the data. So we need to display the data. Let's see how we can manage that. To display the data, just I am using this logic. I will copy and paste that there. So this is in the HTML, what the changes, what the options you have to do. And I showed you that interpolation uses a data binding expression. You can directly display as a literal. This is as a literal. You are displaying as a literal. And this is binding to the properties. You are binding to the attributes actually here. These are attributes. We are binding like this. That is interpolation. So this is interpolation technique. We have another option, property binding and attribute binding also. That means you can bind to property or you can bind to attribute. In order to understand the property and attribute binding, first you should know the difference between property and attribute. What is property and what is attribute? You should know the difference between those two. Generally, HTML tag is defined with attributes. HTML tag is defined with attributes. That means in a HTML tag, suppose I'm using some table. In that we have width, in that we have height, in that we have BG color. So in that we have some align. All these are considered as attributes. You should not call them as property. That means whatever you define in a tag, they are called attributes. And important is HTML elements are defined with properties. Tags are defined with attributes and elements are defined with properties. Technically, element and tag is different. I think you know that in HTML, elements are built by using tags. Elements are built by using tags. HTML is collection of elements, and elements are presented in a hierarchy called DOM, document object model. We know that. How you create any element dynamically actually? Generally, to create any element dynamically, suppose we are using var table is equal to document dot create element table. This will create a table element. Now for the table element, we are defining table dot height is equal to some height, and we are defining table dot width is equal to some width, and we are defining table dot align is equal to some center, something like this. Now these are considered as properties. We call them properties. That means when you are dynamically dealing with a particular element, then properties will come to picture. When you are dealing with statically, then we call them as attributes. So technically, what is difference between attribute and this property? Technically, what is difference actually? Attribute and property. Attributes are statically defined. And important is attributes intention is like, attributes is simply like it is immutable. It is like immutable. What is meant by immutable? You remember what is meant by immutable? Immutable means the state cannot be changed, right? Once we created, we cannot modify. Yes, that means the state cannot be changed. Yes, you cannot modify, or state cannot be changed. Attributes are immutable. Once you define the attributes, they work with the same attributes. But properties are actually mutable. Properties are mutable. That means you can change them dynamically. You can change them dynamically. That means if you want to change dynamically, then you have to use properties. If you don't want to change dynamically, then you have to use attributes. That means tags are defined with attributes and elements are defined with properties, because elements are intended to manipulate dynamically. So here the key concept is, the question for us is when to bind to attribute, when to bind to property. It is always good and important to bind with a property if you want to dynamically change it. If you don't want dynamically change it, just attach. Then what you can do is we can use property attribute. For example, here one more important point is there, attribute and property, right? So that means here the key concept is, when you are dealing with attribute and properties, you should know, in general HTML, you should know that in HTML, actually, every element is having some properties, and same name attributes also present. Same name attributes also present. See, if you are changing through scripting, they are never called as attributes. You should know that, Mr. Babu. If you are changing, then it is not called as an attribute. Understood? You should never call it as an attribute. You cannot say that we can change attributes using scripting. That sentence itself is a blunder. That's not a good sentence at all. Why? Because that sentence itself says that you don't have knowledge of attribute and property. You are saying that we can change attributes using scripting. That is completely mistake. Why? Because the intention of attribute is not to change. That means attributes will never change, and you can never use attributes dynamically. Means in the script, whatever you use is not an attribute. It is called as a property. Understood? In the script, whatever you use, it is called as a property. You should never call as attribute. Attribute should come only when you are using in tags. In a JavaScript, that's what I showed you here now. I created var table and I am defining height, width. What do you call height, width here in the second here? What do you call height and width and align? We call height, width and align. In this case, we call them as properties. Right? In this, we call as properties. And here we call them as attributes. Here we call them as attributes. These are attributes. These are properties. And generally what happens is attribute name and property name can be same. Attribute name and property name can be same. Sometimes we don't have the same name attributes. Same name attributes. Some properties are available, some name is different. For example, I think many of you have learned. That is why knowledge of this is required. What you are doing? You are changing the attribute value, or you changing the attribute? Do you know in your syntax you given, Babu, that is you are sending a value into an attribute. Are you changing the attribute behavior? Are you changing the attribute behavior? You are not changing the attributes, no? Then, right? So that is, you are accessing an attribute in the script. You are accessing an attribute in the script by using attr, and you are thinking that it is an attribute. But once you access in script, it is no longer an attribute. It is called as a property. Understood? At least now, right? It is called as a property. How you will create a value? How do you add a value? How do we define a value? That all happens using properties only, right? So here the key point is we don't have same names. For example, suppose you have input type is equal to text and class is equal to form control. Like this we have defined. So suppose we are using table, right? Table have a property. Table have a property class. Class is form control. Now, can you tell me dynamically how I can apply a class to table? How I can apply a class to table? Table dot. How you can apply a class to the table? Table dot. Table dot. Now tell me, add class is a property or value? Is it a attribute? Is it an attribute? Or it is a property? Actually, there is no property by name class at all. There is no property by name class. In the table class, that is attribute. Understood? In the tag, it is an attribute. Up to this, understood? It is an attribute. Dynamically, if you want to access, if you know JavaScript and all, there is no property called class. We have a property called class name. Class name is equal to form control. You know this, huh? There is a property called class name. That means the attribute name is class and the property name is class name. Understood? That means same name of properties may not be there. The attribute name is different. And when you are using it dynamically, its property name may be different. Sometimes they may be same. That means table.width. Property name is width, attribute name is also width. You have a width attribute, we have a width property. And the class, no. So we have a class or we have a class name. Class is attribute, class name is property. That means I will show you here a simple example here. For example, some web page is there. I will write some rough logic for you to get the details. See, just what I'm doing here is I'm adding simple a script just to make you understand about that. So I'm writing a function, and in the function, let's call that function. I'm creating. So var table is equal to document dot create element. I am creating an element called table, and I want to read all the properties of table. So for var item or simply property in table is an object, and we are reading every property, and let's print the properties. Document dot write, and we are printing the property with a line break. I am writing a simple logic to print all the properties. I am writing a logic to print all the properties of table. Okay, let's run this and see. It is going to print all the properties of table and show us. Remember, we are dynamically dealing with it. That means we are using all the properties here. You can see these are all properties. All properties. Let's search for class. You see, there is no class property. You have either class name or class list. There is no class property. Understood the point now? That means what you write in the tag is always an attribute. Right? What you dynamically define is properties. So that means elements are built with properties. And tags use attributes. That means there is no class at all. There is only attribute. You can bind value to attribute. There's no objection. But attributes not intended to change dynamically. When you are dynamically dealing them, then you call them as properties. So this is one important thing you need to know before going into this. That means here we are writing like this. Value. To the value we are binding some value here. Means through interpolation we are binding. This is attribute binding. This is attribute binding. Now currently you are using this value attribute binding. I will show you one simple example here. Suppose I have a button. Button has some submit. So this submit have a disabled property. This is disabled is an attribute and a property also. The same name is used for both attribute and property. Here it is attribute now. Disabled is an attribute. That means you see here when you define disabled, the button is disabled. It is not working. You can see submit button is disabled. It's not working at all. It is disabled. It's not working currently. Now I want to enable it dynamically. I want to enable dynamically. Then what I will do is here I am creating a property. So public disable button. It is having true. Disable button is having true. And disable button is true. And here I will apply that value here. Disabled is, I need to bind that value here. That means what? It is disabled button. It is true. It is true. That means disabled is supplied with true. Okay, good. Disabled is true. I will open this now. I will see that here disabled is true. Okay, fine. I will change this disabled to false. I will change to disabled to false. That means this false value is passed into this disable button. Now disabled is false. If disabled is false, you know that disabled is a Boolean property. If disabled is false, then it should change. So it should change and it should enable the button. It should enable the button. You see, it is not working because attribute cannot allow to change the values dynamically. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. So you have shown some jQuery code. So by using attr, you can access attribute. Attr, you can access attribute. You are accessing attribute. What is in that? That is nothing. You are accessing attribute. You are supplying some value into it, right? You are not changing it. You are supplying value into it. It's not changing the value. It is supplying value, right? That means now the point here is, now let's do one thing. How we can bind with the property here. This is attribute binding. This is attribute binding. How property binding works. If you want disabled to use as a property dynamically, then put this disabled in square brace. This is property. And for properties, you cannot use interpolation. Then here we can just directly access that disabled button. Disable button. That means the Boolean value, true or false. This time you are controlling this dynamically. You are controlling this dynamically. And currently disabled is supposed true. Disabled is true. And you are passing disabled true. And you can see that. So it is disabled. Submit is not working. Let's go to the logic and change this disabled to false. Now it is a property you are using as a property. Property can be changed with a value and you can see that it is working fine now. Submit is working. I think everyone understood it. That means properties can be changed dynamically. Attributes are not intended to change dynamically. Attributes are not intended to change dynamically. So even you supply some value into it, attribute will not change anything. So how you bind with attributes? How do we bind with properties? That is the important point. That means here Suppose attribute binding. That means what is concept here? So here, how we bind that attribute binding? That means attribute binding. Attribute binding. That means we created. So here, disable button. Disable button is equal to some true. Disable button is equal to true. And we have a button here. And we have disabled. Disabled. Disabled is equal to. We are accessing the value and displaying the value here. For attributes, we have to use interpolation. That means disable button. We are sending that value. So this is some submit button and close the button. This is attribute binding. And how we define property binding? Property binding. That means we need to configure public. So here disable button is equal to true. And property binding, that means we have to define the properties defined in square brace. Disabled, 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 and we can directly access disable button, that value. Whatever value is there, it will get the value and it will use the value. And what you need to do is, so here, what you need is try changing the boolean true to false, and observe both properties and values, both property and value. And you need to observe both property and attribute binding. And what you will observe here is, so attribute will not allow to change its state. Property can change the state, That is what we said here, mutable, and this is immutable. Now it depends on your requirement. If you want to change dynamically according to the situation, you bind to property. If you don't want to change, just you want to display and you want to use it, then you can just go with attribute binding. So that is, attributes are directly written, properties are written in a square brace, and we supply some dynamic value into it. We can directly pass some value into it, like I can pass here true and false like values into it. Disabled is true, then it is disabled. You can directly pass the value into it, right? So this is dealing with it. And very important is, if I say false, that means we are accessing the value from some other source, or we are directly defining its working file. Instead of directly passing a Boolean value, we are checking and sending the value from this reference. Dynamically, you can change this. If it is a valid state, you can enable. Invalid state, you can disable. You can change its behavior. So this is the basic point about property and attribute binding. And very important is, properties should be in square brace and attributes are directly defined. And how to deal with the properties which are not available as attributes, that is another part that we will see how we can deal with them. That we will discuss in our next session, right? Tomorrow we will see some more points about this property and attribute binding. Then we can design one example with them, right? To design an example, first we need to know all these basics. Then we can start designing one example with all this knowledge. What is two-way binding and how it works, all that point. In the next session, we will discuss about that. Okay.